the webinar series, Peace in the Parish and Beyond. This is session number 5. This is Tuesday afternoon, October 14th. I'm here with Father Jim Clark from St. John's Seminary. I'm Greg Stone. As we move forward, I would ask that you mute your mic, because otherwise your end of the line is open. So on the second button on the left, it's the second button in, you can mute and unmute your mic. We are going to record this, so just letting everyone know that this session will be recorded. And so we'll start. And this afternoon, in this fifth in our series, is we're going to look at the subject of negotiation. And this seems like a dry subject, but it's actually where so much of what we've been talking about takes place when we get to the table. And we've been able to convene, and we have parties who have come in order to participate. And this process where we meet and negotiate is very powerful. This is a switch is taking place in the courts. This is actually the preferred process, where the parties are able to talk to one another instead of wait for a verdict from a third party. And we see, in terms of our faith, in terms of the social justice teachings, that this is really the heart of subsidiarity, where we can come together in the smallest group possible to make decisions. And so at this, using mediation, using conciliatory processes, we achieve that end so that we're working one-on-one, and we can actually touch each other's hearts rather than do this in a way that doesn't have that personal flavor.
Absolutely. Subsidiarity is a very tried and true part of our own Catholic tradition, in that very simply it's that wherever the lowest possible denominator of being able to deal with the issue, that's where it should begin. Unfortunately, we live in a culture and society now that, both in terms of its media presentations, in terms of personal anecdotes, as well as personal life stories, that people say, well, we'll go right to the head, call the bishop or call a pastor. And as part of a healthy negotiating skill, it's important to be able to gently but firmly help to lead the person or the parties to that lowest common denominator of how the problem can be dealt with. If not, then the negotiator then can enter the situation and help them to come to see that they have power themselves in a way that the issue can be resolved at the lowest possible denominator.
Yeah, and so often we back away from negotiation. We call a lawyer or a professional, but we're doing ourselves a disservice, because there's a certain basic level of negotiation that we should all be skilled at, because every day we negotiate, some of us better than others. There are, in the area of alternative dispute resolution, there's 2 processes that I'll mention, and they highlight different approaches to the solution. One is mediation, and in mediation it's considered a self-determined process. The parties determine the outcome. The mediator is just there to guide them, to facilitate, to bring his skills to enhance their negotiation, their communication. Arbitration is slightly different, and people sometimes get these terms mixed up. Arbitration is a very different process in that it is a hearing. Very much like a trial. There's ways that discovery is shortened, and appeals are there's very few appeals. So it's made less expensive than a trial, but it has the same nature, in which an arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators determine the outcome. So the parties present their evidence, present their arguments, and then someone else. So that's a key area for us to look at, and we brought that up earlier in terms of the process that we choose. And so what we're looking at in the beginning step, as in Matthew 18:15, is that one-on-one, and that the parties are able to come to a decision. If they're not, then you may go to a process that has a third-party verdict.
We recognize that both clergy and parish leaders, as well as church leaders at large, need to be skilled in both areas, because we're presented with these type of issues and situations of conflict time and time again. And the skills that are used in mediation are a bit different than with arbitration.
Yes. one you're in hearing mode, and in the other you're in facilitator mode. Now, there are hybrid processes that they might call MED-ARB, in which you're mediating with parties, and there's an area that they can't resolve among themselves, and they want a third party to make a decision. Now, you as a mediator have heard more than a typical judge would hear, and so you may not be the person. If the parties agree and they say, we would really like you to make this decision, then it's okay, but you have to be careful that you haven't engaged in a process in which you've learned more than the typical arbitration process, and that creates bias. So you may say, well, rather than having me do that, let me refer you to an arbitrator. So you can mix those. So they may decide on issue 1, 2, and 3, here's how we'd like to settle that. On issue 4, we really need someone else to step in and make that decision for us. Now, as we start this process of negotiation, the opening steps are very, very critical. And this is where process becomes a tool, a powerful tool to enhance what we're doing. And so as we open this process, first we were reminded that this is a creative process and the parties can help design it. So we can start suggesting and asking them about ground rules. What are the ground rules that they need to have in place in order to feel comfortable? In some cases, maybe there's been a lot of acrimony between the parties, and one party says, I'll take part, but you can't call me these names. You can't yell at me. And so you can bring that in as a guideline. And these guidelines end up, they're principle guidelines, ethical guidelines. They end up helping us later on. Because sometimes later on, people will trigger and they'll fall back into old patterns and they'll deviate from the process and become hostile or go away from what we'd hoped as a process. At that point, we can bring them back and say, well, remember at the beginning, you thought it was okay to agree to this guideline, and is there a reason you want to change that now? And in a way, it's a very subtle way, without making someone wrong, of reminding them that there is a way that we're going about doing this work. And so that's important. Some of these guidelines, and I have a whole list that I'll post on a future webinar, a document that you can pull from, but there's things on the list. And once again, you present this to the parties and you ask for their buy-in. It's not like, okay, you have to sign this in order to participate, because if you take that approach, then you've taken away their self-determinism. So you want them to commit from their own heart as a commitment to keep an open mind, to be honest with each other, to be open, commitment to listen deeply and not interrupt, a commitment that each party will be fully heard and that they'll be able to express their interests. There's a commitment to really sharing your interests so the other party knows what it is that you're hoping to achieve. There's a commitment to seek a resolution that's fair and just to all parties. So this kind of sets the tone, it sets the direction when people look at these guidelines, and it gives them safety and it gives them hope. It's like, oh, okay, we're agreeing on a way to go about doing this, and that's very important. And we might ask, how do we judge the satisfaction, or rather the success of what we're doing? This is an issue that mediators have debated for years in terms of what does success look like. Sometimes you may have a party and they negotiate something and you as a mediator do not totally understand why. You're like, why would they want that? But they may have a personal reason that this is what gives them satisfaction. So as a mediator, you're not trying to control what it is that the substance that they negotiate, as much as just making sure that is bringing about satisfaction. Is that really what they want? And we have 3 legs of this satisfaction pyramid or triangle. And the first is the substance. Is the outcome fair, and are people able to walk away and saying, okay, that's just, that's fair, I can live with that, or I'm very happy with that. The other two legs of the triangle are procedural. Was it run in a fair manner, in a just manner? Was I heard? Did we proceed in a logical way, and our concerns were considered? Psychological has to do with, was I respected? Did people treat me with respect? Did I feel that they cared about me and observed my identity? Now, sometimes you can get to, and you'll see people resolve a conflict, and they'll walk away, and maybe one part of this is not in place. Now, as a facilitator of negotiation, that you may want to stop the parties at that point and go, is there something that we overlooked here? Well, yeah, it's okay. We settled. Okay, we can leave now. We've got this done, but I sure didn't like the way I was treated. Okay, now that is a signal to you, the mediator, to the facilitator, to the priest who's working with parties on this, that this might not endure, that there's this piece missing of the satisfaction. And so you can take that up and say, well, maybe there's a way that we can address that. And was there any insult intended? And you can clean that up. So what you're trying to do is clean it up so that there's satisfaction in all these areas. So that as people go forward, they can look back and they go, no, I'm satisfied with that. And you end up with an enduring outcome. We talked before about positions and interests, the need to go below the line, away from positions to interests. Once you get to the table, just the setting and that you're negotiating can trigger that tendency to go to positions. Okay, here's my position. So once again, you have to pay attention to that and say, okay, I think I have heard your position. I think that's on the record now. But what we're concerned with in this process is understanding why you're holding that position. So what interests is that satisfying? What motivates you to hold that position? And so what we're doing is we're freeing up the creativity, because once the positions come on the table, things start to lock down, and your options for resolving this become less and less, and the odds of you resolving it go down greatly.
I've also found, Greg, that sometimes it helps to be able to balance the word with an image. For example, people can tend to quickly move towards positions when certain words flag for them a position. And I'm not just talking about, say, conservative liberal, but that you're with this group because this is their mantra or their saying. Versus interest, it's helpful sometimes, that I found for myself, to say, well, can you give me an image to work with? When you talk about this particular interest, that you feel that this group is the most important group in the parish, or this particular way of looking at things, what's that like for you? Can you give me an image? Is it like the sun in terms of gives complete warmth and guidance to the day, a light? I just want to get underneath what you're saying. And I found sometimes it can even change the conversation to a greater understanding of from both parties, as well as the mediator.
Right. You've brought up a really important point, and I'm glad that you did, is a number of us, myself included, come from a culture and a background, and particularly having studied at a law school, in which we rely on verbal approaches. Most people don't. And so when you start bringing in imagery, when you start bringing in metaphor, story, and other ways of approaching these, it broadens the process, and you add that creativity. I've seen that where I'll start on the process, and I'll just be this will be in the court, let's say, and so I'll be in that setting, and it'll just be verbal, and then you look at the party, and you can see you've lost them. They're not really involved, and it's like, oh, it's the guy with the tie. And he's going off, and you gotta take off the tie, and you touch hearts at that point, and you listen to stories and you find out their way of approaching this, and it can be very different. So that's one thing that we have to remember. I think that's one reason there was discussion, excuse me, at the, it was 2 years ago at the Canon Law Society meeting, which was happening this week in St. Louis. That year it was in Jacksonville. And in that year, one of the topics was looking at, have the faithful come to use or recognize the 83 code? And the answer was unanimously no. And I think the reason that was overlooked there was that most people don't think in terms of codes and laws and so forth. It's not the way they access. So that's something that I think your suggestion is really, really helpful in terms of if there is an issue of canon law that we need to understand in order to trace out the boundaries. Maybe we have that discussion in other terms of what does that look like, what does that mean, so that we make it more friendly. Yeah. Now, one thing we talked about before, and we stress again, is visioning interests, okay? So if we come to the table and we haven't spent that time, it may turn out that the only reason that we're in this conflict is because the other guy said, you can't have that. Like, oh, really? I can't? Off the war you go. And it's just that oppositional nature that we find in the fallen world, where someone pushes against us, we'll push back. Someone tries to take something from us, we'll pull back. And so we have to be careful that we bring reason. We deal at the level of the heart, but we also have to deal at the level of reason and know, okay, what are our real needs, and how do they align with the will of God? Are we fighting over something that at the end of the day we end up feeling guilt and regret and shame that we fought over something that really does not forward our journey, our faith journey?
I think another thing that's helpful is to remember that adults need information, and to withhold knowledge of a situation or a fuller expression of knowledge can demean an adult. I mean, think of the times that if you've ever flown, you're sitting on the tarmac and nobody tells you why, and it goes on for 15 minutes, half hour, an hour, and but just to explain, okay, what brings the parties here? What is the real issue? Or maybe if you happen to be a pastor, you're withholding some information for whatever reason, just to share a bit of that information that's necessary, and that's to this particular situation, can liberate the whole conversation as the adults involved feel like they're sharing in that power.
Yeah, and it's a way of showing respect.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Another process that we use, and you can use this in a formal way. You can set up the whiteboards and make lists and do it in a formal way, but you can also do this in an informal way, which is we stop and we engage in brainstorming. And brainstorming is a process where we come up with solutions and we don't attach an evaluation. In other words, we free ourselves up. We can say, hey, let's throw every solution out there. It may be stupid, may not work, but no stops. We're just going to throw ideas out. And it starts to free people up as they realize that maybe they've been thinking in a very narrow way and had emotional constraints or other constraints. And so brainstorming can help break that open, particularly if you feel that the parties are struggling with options. It's like, okay, let's just open it and see what we can come up with. And then you go back and evaluate them. Values, beliefs, and reasons. This is an interesting area in mediation. Kind of the accepted norm in the field is that we don't attempt to change people's values and beliefs. Instead, what we do is look for ways that we can find common ground. A solution we may be able to state a solution so that it meets my worldview and your worldview. We see it in different ways. We might describe the value it brings in different ways, and yet it's a common solution. So that's one way that we can work around this area. At other times, we get caught. Sometimes we get caught when we approach our values and beliefs as a list in an abstract manner. So, okay, here's a list of what I believe in. And that's valid. I mean, certainly we have a creed, and we live within that creed. But on the other hand, we have to be careful that we don't overlook how do we live it. In other words, how do we take that value, that commandment, that code, and how do we translate that into real terms in terms of how do I live that? And because when we do, it's very much like going from positions to interests, is we're looking at, okay, what does that mean in terms of how I live this? And as we start talking about it at that level, what it means to me at a personal level, now there's increased respect. If I just say to someone, okay, here's my beliefs here, you can just read it right here. I want you to accept that in terms of what we're doing. You're going to get rejection most times. Whereas if you say, in my life, here's how I've lived that, here's what it's meant to me, and you give some examples. Now suddenly someone's dealing with your heart. They're much more willing to consider that. I think that's a little bit of what's going on in the Synod right now.
Exactly. I think it's important for us to remember that wonderful quote by St. Thomas Aquinas, who said, we must learn to love those opinions that we share as well as those that we disagree with, because both have labored in the search for the truth.
Yeah.
It's an important thing, I think, at this time where the clergy person as well as the church leader, when they're involved in this type of conflict resolution, can hear the values, beliefs, and reasons through the conversation. At the same time, to just clearly, perhaps catechetically remind the participants of the Catholic worldview, not in a heavy-handed way, but gently say, well, that fits in well with what we believe as Catholics, keeping in mind that da-da-da-da. And that, once again, opens up the conversation. So to remind the folks that the reason they've come to you because you represent the Church, and they are at some level inviting you individually as well as a representative to help them to see more clearly how they can resolve this issue.
Yeah. It's not advocating a moral relativism,
no.
But instead it's advocating that communicating it at a level of lived experience.
Yes.
How does this value come forth in the world? And then there are times when you go into a negotiation and there's, for whatever reason, someone insists that you have to abandon your values. And at that point you may need to leave the process. There's an interesting list put together by the Reverend Brian Cox, an Anglican who has been working in Kashmir in the Middle East doing faith-based diplomacy. He's been working between Christians and Muslims, between Hindus and Muslims, and doing this work. And the core of when he brings people together into a reconciliation seminar has been this list of core values that he identified these as the core values of the Abrahamic faiths. And so he starts with familiarizing the parties with these values and seeing, do they accept them? And this is, in a way, creating those guidelines that we talked about before. So this is a list. His book, Faith-Based Reconciliation, does a good job of explaining these and how they work in a practical way. And so at that point, sorry, we had a little interruption there. Okay. And so in terms of deciding what are going to be the ethical guidelines, how are we going to work with one another, this is a starting list. And I invite you to look at it and see, does this help in your work in this area? One of the things that's kind of included but not is the idea of inclusivity. But there's another concept that is very core, maybe even to this whole list, and that's the idea of reciprocity. The golden rule is, when we sit down to negotiate with someone, are we going to acknowledge each other in a reciprocal manner? I think in some cases in the interfaith dialogue with the Muslim world, sometimes that discussion hasn't been there. You could see that in the apostasy laws, where that is obviously violates the principle of reciprocity, where if someone else moves away from that faith, then they're subject to dire punishment. So that brings things into a mediation like this that we have to be aware of, because otherwise we can overlook, and it can seem like we're making progress when we're not.
I think it's a good example of how we have to really be aware of the Catholic approach to our spirituality is always contextualized by the situation in which we are presented, as well as the situation that we live in. And so here's a good example of how these are some wonderful themes that Reverend Cox has pulled out as a way that we as Catholics can reach a place not only of agreement, but if nothing else, the first step in working with people of different faith experiences.
Right. And you'll see on this list that obviously we are talking about people of other faith groups, and when we're not, when we're talking in the secular world, these are still our core values.
Absolutely.
So how do we introduce those in that conversation? That's subject for a lot of work on our part. Settlement criteria. All of these things have been leading up to what are the criteria that we need to see in place before a deal is valid, before we can come to a conclusion. And those settlement criteria, in addition to the core values, in addition to our guidelines of how we want to work with one another, include, the will of God. How does this agreement look in that sense? There might even be cases where parishioners may be resolving a situation, and they may want to take their proposed outcome, their proposed settlement, to the pastor and say, what does this look like from your point of view? And that's a way that we can help people, is to give them that additional viewpoint. Now, certain things block us in terms of arriving at the right settlement criteria and coming to a good deal. These are of them. They're basically shortcuts that we use. Okay, when we're thinking through a deal and making decisions, we use these shortcuts because it saves time and it seems to make it easy, but these can lead to errors, overconfidence. We can jump in and think, hey, we know what this is about, we know everything about it, and maybe we don't. And so we have to check and make sure that, have we really done our homework? Faulty data. We may be working in a negotiation, and the information, the data that we're working on is just not factual. It's not true. We may need to bring in an expert to help us understand that area. We see that in many of the larger negotiations, even things doing with groups, and even like the synod. Maybe there's faulty data that's been entered. Oh, this is what we believe. No, wait a second. Let's look at how has that been stated throughout time, and is there an error in the way we've presented it right now? Another one is first offer. We are so nervous about negotiating that someone makes an offer. Oh, good, it's on the table. Great. I accept that. Let's move on. And that may get the process done, but it won't lead to an enduring outcome. There'll be resentment later. There'll be second thoughts. So we don't want to do that. We want to spend the time, respect both ourselves and the other party in terms of giving enough time to this. Another error we can make is seeking a solution to fit all criteria. In other words, one solution that meets every single criteria. Very rare. We don't live in a perfect world. Very rare to have perfect solutions. So rather than that, we realize, okay, maybe in some areas this is not going to be perfect, but it is going to be something that allows us to go forward. Recalling recent vivid events, things that stick in our mind as, okay, that's the way life is. And then we realize we've sampled just a small area of something that was very vivid, that caught our attention, but it doesn't really represent the whole universe of options available. flawed baseline, same kind of thing, where maybe we read in the newspaper that someone got McDonald's coffee spilled on them, and they won a $25 million lawsuit. So we go, okay, here we are in mediation in court, and around 25 million should do it. And it's like, it's an insult to the other party. People consider you're not here seriously, and because we've just grabbed a baseline. And we could do that in marriage. It's really interesting. Sometimes people look at their marriage, and their baseline is their parents' marriage. Mm-hmm. It may turn out that was not a really good marriage. Yeah. And so we may be operating on comparing our marriage to a baseline that is not valid. Yeah. So there's ways.
I think there's another aspect that can affect a faulty decision, and that is the one who is mediating the whole work needs to be really in touch with life as being imperfect. Reality is not always measuring up to people's expectations. And secondly, the mediator's own understanding of their need or desire to please both parties. And I know for clergy, in a way, we're kind of encouraged or even affirmed for people-pleasing, but this can really make it difficult to be effective in this whole process, because in the end, people may not get all of what they want, and to accept the reality that this is an imperfect reality and we're doing the best we can given what we're been presented.
Yeah, sometimes the priest or the mediator needs to provide a reality check. And the parties, yeah, they may snarl at you. I've had people do become emotional when they're, okay, let's take a look at how this really is. I've had attorneys slam their briefcases and storm out of the room, and I've had people just go off. And that's okay. As a mediator, you're there. If you have a very sensitive ego, this work becomes very difficult. Yeah. Because in a way, you are becoming the lightning rod for all of those emotions, those destructive emotions, those triggers, and they really appreciate it when you are there. I had one mediation which an attorney just totally lost it. Slammed the desk, slammed his briefcase, grabbed his coat, headed for the door, and said, "This is over. This is done. We're out of here." Well, of course, his clients didn't agree. And they sat there, and it was really funny. It was one of those quiet moments where they sat there just locked on me, eyeball to eyeball. They weren't moving a muscle. And it was like, you could see they wanted me to, okay, help us here. And so the attorney calmed down and then came back, as you could see his clients weren't following him. But then afterward, I took, I met with the attorney separately and said, could you help me understand what was going on? And we ended up having a wonderful conversation. We actually went and met at his house, and he explained some of the emotions that came up when he felt when things weren't fair. And we ended up having a great relationship, which helped the whole process with his clients.
I think just a little technique that helps me in these situations is to very simply keep saying to myself inside when it gets a little emotionally traumatic, this isn't about me. This isn't about me. And not to own the negativity that might be in the room, or the client trying to work you over, but rather just very simply just remaining firm and doing what Greg's talking about, just remembering that you're there as a representative not only of the church, but reminding everyone of the kingdom values that we proclaim.
That's right. And this is a Holy Spirit-driven process. So if you allow it, and if you allow for those quiet moments, and you allow for people to reflect on what's happening, and you don't react so that they feel embarrassed. In other words, you go with them and say, that's part of the process. Yes. I'm here for you. I'll go wherever you need to go. I'll walk whatever path you need to walk on. That's what we're doing here. And then they ease into that, and the Holy Spirit can come into the process. Risk. There's very common ways that we deal with risk and loss. We don't like risk, and we don't like loss. And it's interesting, you can frame the same thing. Let's say that there's an offer, let's say there's a claim for $30,000. Okay, some damage has been done to a house or whatever. And so there's a claim for $30,000. The other party makes an offer of $20,000. Okay, here's $20,000. Now we can look at that in two ways. We can look at that, wait, that's a $10,000 loss. Okay? That's, you're giving me 20, I lost it, I'm losing 10,000. I'll fight I'll go to court, okay? Because I'm not going to lose $10,000. Take the same situation and you frame it in a different way, you've just gained $20,000 that you didn't have. Mm-hmm. So there's a gain sitting on the table, and if we walk away from this, you may not see that. You're taking a risk that you may lose that $20,000 that's on the table in front of you. You frame it that way, and they're like, okay, I got to take that. Yeah. So we avoid risk, we avoid loss. You can take the same situation and frame it differently. And attorneys, good attorneys and good negotiators will sometimes try and frame it in a particular way to get a result that they want. As a mediator, you kind of have a responsibility to offset that with offering the parties both frames and saying, which frame would you like to accept? One of the things, there may be an open mic. If you get a chance, check the second button on the bottom left and mute your mic. Missing skills. This is just a list that you can consult in the PowerPoint. Different things that we lack in terms of negotiation. Then we go on, what are we doing? What are we actually doing when we negotiate a mediated settlement? Because we're building a bridge that allows us to negotiate an exchange of value. And sometimes this area of negotiation, free enterprise, people get a negative view of it, as opposed to looking at the whole process of negotiating and exchanging value it's a relationship event. And when we're able to exchange value, give another value, accept value from another, we've really enhanced a relationship. So that's why this is an important part of life skills.
I agree, Greg, especially for us priests. In this time in human history, perhaps more than any other, to me, I see one of the important roles of a priest is as a bridge builder. We say that the Pope is the Pontificus Maximus, but as fellow clergy, we share in that to a lesser degree, and that is a bridge between cultures, between different linguistic groups, between different age groups, between different value systems, between different people who are in conflict with each other. And so this work that we're talking about has great value, not just value for this particular situation, but eternal value, because we're reminding of the great chasm between God and humanity, and how God uses ordinary situations, ordinary people to build these bridges to create a more authentic community and right relationship. So this is excellent work.
Yeah, it's about stewardship.
Stewardship.
Yes. How do we do this? Tactics. Often, particularly if you're working with attorneys and so on, you might come into the area of tactics. In a competitive situation, tactics are valid. It's funny when you read the American Bar Association, basically the rules, tactics figure in, and it's okay. It's really odd to read this, but the American Bar Association finds it okay that you can misrepresent, that you can, in a sense, engage in certain areas of deception. Now, you cannot make a material misrepresentation. In other words, say, the house is 3,000 square feet when it's only 1,000. So a material misrepresentation is off the table. But representations in terms of intention, in terms of perception of value, are a whole gray area. And, and they are legitimately gray areas. How do we find out the value of something? Often it's in the negotiation process that we find out how much value does that have to me, how much value to the other person. But tactics are something that we need to, I think, as a society, look at, because there's an ethical view, and we find this particularly in the legal community in Hollywood and Wall Street and in Washington. And I think this is what people, the culture objects to and feels that the culture is being, the society is being broken down. And that's the idea, and it's an ethic that's come up where if I cheat you, it's your fault. You were not smart enough to avoid my deception. And that kind of ethic of blame the person that you've cheated is very common. And it's gotten into our culture. And you may think, well, okay, it's like a survival of the fittest. You know, I had the best attorney, and boy did he fool you, and you know, there we go. But it breaks down trust, and a culture cannot survive without trust. And it's interesting. I think the church is an institution that can start addressing this and start bringing trust back into our culture, and looking at collaborative ways that we work with one another that avoid this situation.
I think it's also important to remember that we speak about being peacemakers in the kingdom of God. It does not mean that we roll over and play dead, nor that we be naive. Rather, that we learn the proper skills and we continue to hopefully maintain the high moral ground, remembering not only who we are as beloved children of God, but also what does it mean to live in and to speak the truth with integrity. These are all high principled ideas, but they become embodied when we live up to them in dealing with conflict.
Which takes us to our next slide, which is the idea of two forces at work in this world. One is the mediator, even Christ, the mediator, who seeks to reconcile us with God. And that's a constructive third party who seeks to bring about reconciliation. And then we have the hidden influence, the destructive third party. And this starts in the garden with the serpent being a destructive third party who brought about strife between man and God. So we can analyze, as we go forward and we look at a situation, we can analyze, okay, what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with someone who's a constructive third party? Or are we dealing with someone who's a destructive third party? So we look at, on these next slides, a mediator, a constructive third party, identifies miscommunication and misunderstanding, identifies interests and motivations, designs creative solutions that satisfy interests through collaboration, heals the hurt that's been suffered, recognizes and heals transgressions, areas of confession and unburdening, helps structure and deliver apology, which is very important, helps parties find their forgiving heart, helps parties extend forgiveness to one another, assists with plans for a future based on mutual caring. That's the outcome. Drafts the settlement agreements that reflect that. We're creating a positive. We're helping the parties create their own positive future, and we acknowledge that reconciliation with ritual. We say, okay, we've done something. We've gone somewhere. When we're dealing with a destructive third party, we find someone who intentionally creates miscommunication and misunderstanding. Okay? Causes confusion regarding interests and motivations, defeats attempts at collaboration, exacerbates the pain and suffering that people are feeling, discourages and sabotages apology and forgiveness, and actively blocks reconciliation efforts. It's really interesting, as a mediator, as a peacemaker, as a pastor, we do find those times when suddenly someone's blocking us. And that's, we don't take it personally. However, we recognize, okay, what is the effort there? And as we are using this, we can begin to assess the situation and assess the players and look at, okay, are there parties involved who are driving this away from reconciliation?
And more to the practical elements of this list of qualities for either the third party, whether it's the mediator,
the constructive or the destructive
third party, or the destructive,
yeah,
is these can be experienced, as we well know, as when we're in these positions of mediation, through, for example, tone of voice, body posture, body language, their vocabulary is chosen. All of these are ways that this is lived out. And very often, I know I find for myself is asking questions. I just noticed that you smirked a minute ago at that comment.
Right.
What's that saying? Or I noticed that you shifted, it seemed like it was uneasily. What are you trying to say? Those are the things I think are a way of bringing it out of the darkness in a bit of a light to be able to move towards some sort of understanding.
Yeah, what we'll find next week is probably the most important week of this series, in which we're going to discuss that destructive third party. And we find that often that destructive third party is working in the shadows. It's working covertly because it's based on fear. So if you have someone who's working, but their whole motivation comes from fear, they're going to tend to be hidden and covert because fear drives that. So there's a dynamic there that one has to become sensitive to. Discovery is part of this whole process of what are we really dealing with. Litigation discovery is very aggressive, it's hostile, it's usually an attempt to set up the party to be impeached in front of the jury. And because of that, it often doesn't unearth as much real information as mediation discovery, which is in mediation discovery, you have a different purpose. You're not trying to impeach the other person, you're trying to find out what do they really want. What would bring peace to them? What would allow us to reconcile? So your motive is different than it is in litigation. And these are two very extreme differences. And this is not just in these processes, because in life we tend to take the Perry Mason litigation mode, where okay, we're gonna find out. Oh, you said that, but no, the other day you said that, so you're impeached. And that can lead us into dead ends as opposed to mediation discovery, which interestingly enough usually provides more information on transgressions and what's gone wrong. And sometimes it results in a confession, and other times it doesn't, but at least it shines light on it in ways that in litigation you have rules of evidence, you have rules of procedure. It's not a first-person lived truth. It's a truth that is managed in terms of the litigation process. And so that's why some people walk out of a litigation thing and go, that's justice, and they're disappointed in that. Well, that's that process. If you want justice, sometimes you need to go to one of these processes. Important concept, the BATNA. Okay. BATNA, I think this was Urey and Fisher out of Harvard, in some of their great books, Getting to Yes, Getting Past No, and so on, that I highly recommend. They came up with this term, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what they suggested was, if you walk into a negotiation, but you don't have an alternative, in other words, this is it, you have to negotiate something, then you can be put in a corner. Yeah. Coercion can be used to push you into a place where you don't want to go. And a way around that is, before you enter the process, what is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? This isn't your bottom line. We don't want to think of it as the bottom line. Okay, if they don't meet my bottom line, then I'm out of here. It's not that. It's like, because you don't know your bottom line. You may, in negotiation, you may find out, what I thought was my bottom line isn't. And I like the deal that's on the table. This is if you just can't negotiate it. You can't come to that. So rather than being put up against the wall and coerced, you have an alternative. You've thought it through. It's rational. It's not something that you're doing in the heat of the moment. You've thought it through ahead of time, and you know you can turn to it.
It could be something as simple as dealing with two different parish groups that want to use the same room or the same property at the same time, the same night, and both have a long history at the parish. And perhaps as they come to meet you, you recognize that one is going to win out, one's going to, in a sense, lose. But a best alternative would be, for example, to already have checked the parish calendar and to present to them, well, listen, we do have another alternative. It would mean that you'd have to make a switch. But here we have Wednesday night open up at the same time, the same location. Would you be willing to accept that? and that becomes the best alternative. And to keep that present before the party, it allows them to, in a sense, to start off new, to have a new beginning that might invite more people to their particular group.
Right. Or it may be even more extreme, where, okay, I realize that we can't hold the events there. And the best alternative is to close that group.
Yeah.
To say, okay, we're not gonna fight over this this situation. This is what we talked about before. A reason accompanies each offer. Every time that an offer is given back and forth, it's accompanied with a reason. Why should the other party accept this as valid? And that shows respect for the other party. Very key. What we're trying to avoid is coercion and domination. And St. Francis hated coercion and domination. This was something that he found unacceptable. And yet, this is what we usually think of when we think of power. So we're going to go quickly down the path of looking at power. I've defined it in the book, Taming the Wolf, as the ability to affect the decisions, actions, and behavior of others. So we get away from that coercion and domination. There's many ways that we can affect their decisions, actions, and behavior. So this is a realistic definition, because if the group, if the person that you're working with conforms to your wishes, you have power. If they don't, you don't have power. So it gives us a broader look at what we're doing.
I like that definition, Greg, because it means, in effect, that every one of us have power in one way, shape, or another.
Absolutely, and we often forget that when we go into negotiation. And I just mentioned at this point some of the paradoxes of power. Certainly the most paradoxical was Christ saying, "Turn the other cheek." It's basically saying, don't resist, don't use resistance, stay there, witness to it, but don't use coercion, domination, force, effort, these kinds of things. And we saw that with St. Peter. That's one of my favorite areas of Scripture to really study, because I've really grappled with this. Is sometimes St. Peter was considered, well, he denied the Lord, he became a coward. No, he didn't. If we look back, just prior to that in the garden, he lopped off the ear of the guard. He pulled out his sword. He was ready to sacrifice himself and go to war. And Christ said, no, we're not going to do this. Jesus turned to him and said, no, I'm not going to do it that way. And so now Peter, what he's experiencing is, wait, the rules of the game changed. And I think he was in this area of really trying to understand what has Jesus taught us here to go forward. And then, of course, he learns that. So we see new ways of using power in that, most importantly. We can negotiate power. As we go into negotiation, we often forget that we can negotiate how we're going to use power. Mediation itself is a negotiation regarding power. If you're in court and one party has great resources, they can basically litigate until they bankrupt you. Mediation is saying, okay, but we're not going to use that kind of power. We're going to set that in abeyance. We're going to go in and see if we can use other kinds of power, because we realize sometimes use of coercive or forceful power has a backlash. Later, it can end up with results that we don't like. So we start to negotiate power. This is a list that you can use to just assess, okay, are we having problems with that? And then we go to the types of power. And this is important because we all do possess power. And the different types of power, which are listed on the PowerPoint, mediation itself is procedural power. The process itself gives parties a chance to have their wishes accepted. They are able to control the decisions of others, because maybe they've never been able to really talk about it. So procedure brings a power. There's personal power. Someone may have a lot of charisma. Someone may be seen as having a lot of integrity. They bring that to the table, and there's power in it. Expert power, where we put the facts out and say, here's what the experts say. That's power. The power to exchange. I'm able to exchange. reward power, punishment.
Power of leadership, power of position,
Right.
power of clergy in the church, or leadership in the church.
Hierarchy.
Power of respect.
Exactly, which can be personal power. So we need to assess when we go in. And one thing that we often forget is the power of prayer, and divine providence. Sometimes when we slow up and we turn to prayer and divine providence, these things have we see powers that we didn't recognize before. So we're reminded that when we go into these situations, we don't throw up our hands and go, the other guy's just going to run over me. Don't assume that. Work with these things. I've seen situations where resource power, which seemed to allow a party to litigate, suddenly you got into negotiating it, and because that person had resources, they were able to say, I understand your situation. You don't need to pay rent for the next 6 months. I have enough money. I can carry it. So they use their resources to a positive. So where we're headed for is we want to get to a negotiated settlement or agreement. And there's a wonderful work, The Moral Imagination by Jean-Paul Lederach. And he's looked at the peace accords that have come after various wars, and he's found them really wanting because they deal with just that, and they fail to actually put forth what he calls platforms for change. How do we structure this? So what we've created is a platform for how we interact with one another and how we go forward. And that book is The Moral Imagination by Jean-Paul Lederach. Wonderful. He gets into, speaking of metaphors, he looks at the whole conflict area in terms of spider webs and connections, and he has some wonderful ways of looking at it. The thing that we want to do at the end is we want to celebrate the outcome. Sometimes the parties may settle it, but they forget to tell their stakeholders that they've settled. So, your friends are still fighting one another, divorce, okay? Your friends are still fighting it out, but you've had a successful mediation, you've moved forward, whatever. So, and I know that's an area that you talk to in your book, celebration and how that is with respect to ritual and rite.
Absolutely. It brings a clear closure to the issue that's been dealt with. It also helps people transition into the new reality. I think one thing we've really learned from this session, Greg, is that whatever position we're in, we're all called to be negotiators for a better life, better reality, better relationship, better understanding. And it means respecting the power that we all have, the power of influence, the power of position, to be able to work for these very kingdom values that we proclaim by our faith.
Exactly. Thank you. So we're going to end the recording now, end the session. I didn't